administration that seemed to do everything in its power to distance the United States from its greatest and most loyal ally in the region. Having had said that, we're concerned that President Trump has a misplaced conception of the true intentions of the Palestinian Authority. On September 13, 1993, as you all remember, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords together with Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn. The currency then was promises, mere words. Israel's currency in exchange for these promises was something very real and very tangible, land. In the almost 24 years since the Oslo Accords were signed, we have seen these same promises recycled over and over again, while Israel made very real land withdrawals, which put many of their people at more risk. And of course, the most salient example was the Gaza withdrawal in 2005. So since the Land for Peace paradigm has resulted in not only thousands of rockets coming in from Gaza, now, of course, after President Obama brokered this Iran deal, the JCPOA, there are at least 100,000 rockets on the north in the Golan. Since Oslo, there have been 2 waves of intifada, plus the most recent stabbing and automobile ramming wave, plus 3 wars. The Gaza War, December of 2008 through January of 2009. Operation Pillar of Defense in Gaza in November of 2012, and Operation Protected Edge in the summer of 2014. Israel has endured the death of over 1,000 innocent civilians since the signing of the Oslo Accords, and among them are 69 Americans, plus two of the Americans that were killed were pregnant, so 2 unborn babies. Here to discuss whether or not this paradigm of land for peace actually works, and whether or not it's time to start employing a new strategy, a new vision for peace, is Gregg Roman of the Middle East Forum.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So what I like to do before I begin a talk is just to kind of take a survey in the audience of who has been to the Middle East, and specifically if we're looking at the meeting between President Reuven Rivlin of Israel and President Donald Trump of Israel. He said, I think to President Trump in the last meeting that took place, it's good to be outside of the Middle East. But I'd like to just remind this audience today in the U.S. Congress that Israel is very much in the middle, if not the geographic center of everything in the Middle East. Thanks, EJ, for that reference earlier. And let's do a quick survey. So who's been to Israel in this room? Great. Who's been to another Middle Eastern country besides Israel? All right, good. We're in Congress. We have professionals here. Who's been to, well, Jordan doesn't count because you were just there for the first time. Who's been to Tunisia? Or to Morocco? That's great. How about to Iraq? All right, so maybe Egypt or Jordan were the only countries that we're talking about. Anybody not Egypt or Jordan or Morocco? Where have you been? Gaza? Well, it's still technically part of Israel. But in all seriousness, the reason I ask that is because when we have to talk about the paradigm of Middle East peacemaking, or in this case, Middle East war making, I think that it's important to recognize what other countries think about Israel from their own perspectives. And I'm going to start off with that analysis and then get into what we have at the Middle East Forum, a project that we started about a year ago under the leadership of E.J. Kimball, sitting here in the back, the Israel Victory Project, which actually culminated in its first major success about a month ago today, I think, minus a day or two, with the launch of the Congressional Israel Victory Caucus, which is essentially a legislative body, a working group, if you will, to pass resolutions, policies, letters, policy initiatives to try to bring the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration to encourage Israel to win in its conflict against the Palestinians and other Arab belligerents around its borders. When President Trump started off his visit in Saudi Arabia, landing in Riyadh and being greeted not just by King Salman of Saudi Arabia and his son, the defense minister Mohammed bin Salman, but also by 53 other leaders of Muslim and Arab countries, not just in the Middle East, but through the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, we saw for the first time the president of this country mentioned the need for a sacrosanct relationship between the United States and Israel, and imploring the American, Arab, and Muslim allies, some who are allies on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and enemies on Tuesday and Thursday, taking every other weekend off, that it's important for U.S. national security to encourage a strong Israel. And to also encourage, insofar as there's a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, a strong Sunni-Arab-Israel relationship. And the reason why I start off with this is because the paradigmatic shift that we're trying to achieve in the U.S. Congress of trying to change the peace processing mindset of American administrations, whether it be coming from the executive branch or encouragement from the legislative branch, something like 42 years ago today was the first time that U.S. negotiations with Yitzhak Rabin and Gerald Ford actually broke down. And there was a letter, this was right, with Kilometer 101, and they're trying to start the Sinai negotiations between Kissinger after the Yom Kippur War, and there was this break and this pause between Ford and Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. And we saw 67 senators sign a letter. It was the first time that AIPAC really had a very strong legislative victory as it led to the peace process. And then, insofar as we now look at ourselves 42 years later, we're still writing letters, we're still asking for resolutions, all based on the same tenet that if you talk without having strength behind your negotiations, you're actually going to be able to get somewhere. But at the end of the day, Anwar Sadat and King Hussein of Jordan realized that the jig was up when the Israelis weren't willing to give an inch. And only then did they enter into peace processing with the Israel, once the war was over. Unfortunately, the war between Israel and the Palestinians is not over. We have a newly elected leader of Gaza, of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who has ran on a platform, Hamas's secret Politburo campaign, to essentially rid Palestine of a Jewish presence. We have 6, 7, 8 different possible successors to Mahmoud Abbas once he leaves, or whether it's by death or resignation or he's thrown out of the Palestinian Authority, who all pledge to not renounce violence. Maybe Abbas did in English, not necessarily in Arabic, as we just heard from Sarah. But all of his successors in waiting have all committed to a process of violence, of negating the idea of a Jewish state, of rejectionism that started in 1921 with the appointment of the Sheikh Haj Amin al-Husseini by the British. And we've seen the same thing, Palestinian generation after generation, rejectionist after rejectionist, we've seen the same exact process. And the reason why it has worked for the Palestinians for about 96 years is because they always had the backing of greater Arab allies, to be able to do it in the United Nations, international fora, to be able to do it within the Arab League, to have the 3 no's from the Khartoum conference shortly after the Six-Day War. However, Trump's speech that he made in Riyadh on Saturday, I think it was, maybe Sunday, earlier this week, was asking the Arabs to embrace the idea that to work with the Israelis to bring a solution to the table was one in which was to their benefit because of the larger specter of a dominant Iran, of a Shia axis now trying to overthrow Sunni control, whether it be in Lebanon. It's already lost in Syria. They've basically given up all of their control to the Abadi government in Iraq. And also going so far as Yemen right now is teetering towards a Houthi victory. The reason why there's a $110 billion weapons transfer to the Saudis is to make up for 8 years of Obama choking off the Saudi military from being able to have a qualitative military edge over the Iranian-backed Houthi forces in the Yemeni civil war that's going on right now. So the moderate Sunni Arab states are starting to realize that if they get closer to Israel and they're rewarded by the United States, they will be able to have a larger level of deterrence and a larger ability to win low-intensity conflict in areas where they're engaged right now in proxy fights against the Iranian forces, whether it be in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or in Yemen. And that conflict may soon extend, whether it be to the Sinai Peninsula, to trying to have tension between Turkey and the Iranians. Even if we go up to Azerbaijan, the Azero-Karabakh conflict right now between the Armenians and the Azeris, where the Russians have a little bit of an interest. And you also have the Iranians who are trying to get involved in other conflicts, whether it be in Libya, supporting Al-Hada in Tunisia, and other countries. So the Sunni Arab rulers, if they get closer to Israel, their caveat is Israel has to help us with our defense. So what are they going to do if they do get close to Israel? They say, let's make an agreement. We'll try to go back to the Saudi Peace Initiative, this long-heralded, often long-failing initiative started in 2002 under the previous king of Saudi Arabia, where they say, we will recognize Israel if Israel gives up on all the major things in which the Palestinians are asking for. Let the refugees back in, recognize the 67 borders, have Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, and give recognition to the Palestinians, all the international fora, stop the blockade of Gaza, so on and so forth. That would be a nice proposition if the Palestinians were ready to accept the own terms that the Saudis are asking the Israelis to accept. Unfortunately, that's a non-starter. So when President Trump goes into the region, you have Secretary Tillerson say we are expecting the Israelis and the Palestinians, based on the huge amount of pressure that we have put on them, to get back to the negotiating table. I feel like it's September of 1993 all over again. The Israelis are making measures on the ground, the Palestinians are offering nice words in English, and then maybe they'll come to an agreement, and who's going to enforce that? Back in 93, at least you had the PLO arriving from Tunis, putting a semblance of control over Gaza and the West Bank. With 94, the Hebron-Gaza Accords, 96 with the Paris Agreement, which was made to negotiate the economic arrangements between Palestinians and Israelis, the setting up of the AHLC. Is everyone familiar here with the AHLC? It's the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee. That's the international body chaired by the Norwegians, which is essentially the way in which donors to the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis agree on joint projects every 6 months. Palestinians come, they say we need a wastewater treatment plant, we need 3 new schools, we need a jihadi recruitment center, we need to have a new hospital. Norwegians say, how much is that going to cost? So that's something that takes place on a standing basis every half a year. There's also other donor conferences that take place after major catalytic events that involve heated conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians. After Ofer V'Tzedakah, Operation Cast Lead, they get together in Paris and say, we need $3 billion to raise money for the rebuilding of Gaza. Maybe 5% of that money of what was pledged actually comes in and they build. The Qataris come in with $1 billion and they actually make a significant amount of trends in rebuilding Gaza. 2012 happens, Amud Anan, Operation Pillar of Defense, and then more of Gaza is raised and more buildings are then needed for another donor conference where we have Paris 2 that takes place in 2013. Some building starts again, and then the real conflict happens with Operation Tzuk Eitan, Protective Edge, where we see the largest amount of destruction in Gaza since the '67 war. And of course, what happens? $4 billion more pledged in Paris under the aegis of a John Kerry negotiated donors conference. And this is in addition to the billions of dollars which is already given to the Palestinians on an annual basis through the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee donor project mechanism. So, what do we have right now? We have Sunni Arab states that are leery of Iran. We have a permanent structure set up to continue Palestinian rejectionism. We have 5 generations of Palestinian rejectionists. And we have President Trump coming to the Middle East saying, guys, let's get back to the negotiating table for the 37th time in the last 23 years. Great paradigm for really trying to start a peace negotiation. This is very different because President Trump, the ultimate deal maker, is in the room. Now, I do not want to disparage the goodwill that President Trump has brought to this negotiating table, bringing brand new people outside of the peace processing industry, whether it be Greenblatt, a former real estate lawyer from New York, Cohn, his advisor that's sitting right here now in Brussels at the NATO talks, David Friedman, the newly appointed ambassador from the 5 towns, I think, in Long Island, great place. Anybody's from the 5 towns? It's a long way away from Bethel in Judea, where he would have a second home if he could. But the rhetoric of the campaign has now turned into the reality of policy making, and now we see the 37th iteration of the Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiating process. So let's play this out a little bit, and I'll tell you why Israeli victory is the better option than a negotiated settlement. Let's say everything works beautifully. Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu, they sit in the room, they sign the papers, they're on the White House lawn. Day 1 of implementation takes place. What are we looking at? We have solutions to refugees, we have solutions to Jerusalem, we have a solution maybe to the water issue of the salinity level of the Gaza aquifer getting to the point where 60% of the Gaza population under the age of 18 has dysentery. We've solved all the problems. Everything is on paper. The plan is ready to be implemented. Trump has succeeded in negotiating Middle East peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Arabs are on board. The Iranians are flummoxed. They don't know what happened. Hamas is disarmed. How is that going to actually happen? In what mind will Yahya Sinwar, Marwan Issa, Ismail Haniyeh, Khaled Mashal, Mohammed Abu Zwik, any of the other Palestinian leadership in Gaza, or any of the other Palestinian diaspora leadership in the Hamas Politburo, whether it's the recently assassinated, he was not with us anymore, the recently assassinated head of the Hamas UAV wing in Tunisia, or one of the heads of their military brigades for the central Rafah district who was killed in Gaza. Who is going to implement this peace accord? Half of the Palestinian people aren't even on board because their leadership isn't on board with this. So what you're talking about is a negotiated agreement between the Fatah party and the Palestinian Central Committee from the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli Prime Minister's office, probably with a Knesset-approved peace accord. So half of the people that you're already trying to make peace with, it's not even going to work out. And then, let's get to Fatah for a second, and to the rest of the PA. Mahmoud Abbas is 85. Someone want to give me a correction on his age? 85? 82. 82. Probably by the time it's up, he'll be 85. So he signed the paper. His one son has a monopoly over all the cigarettes in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. His other son controls Jawal, Palestinian telecom. So he's controlling the airwaves and he's controlling all the smoke that's going up into the air. That's great. Abbas is not going to be around to implement any negotiation that he signs. And this is like under the 1% assumption that he's actually going to complete the negotiating process. I'm trying to give Trump the best light of day, the best optimistic opportunity to say that we're going to have this agreement. So even if that 1%, 0.0001% that we actually get to a negotiated settlement, who on the Palestinian side is going to implement that agreement? Even if Abbas is there. His ministers don't agree with this. Members of his own party don't agree with this. The newly elected vice president of Fatah still reserves the right to armed conflict. He said that. Mahmoud al-Alul said this back in 2013. That was his latest interview before he was elected head of that. And let's go over some of the other actors just to see who we have to consider who might be implementing this agreement. All right. The first guy that you guys should know about is named Hussein al-Sheikh. He is the Palestinian Minister of Civil Affairs. This is the de facto Palestinian Authority governor of Gaza. Whenever anything goes wrong in Gaza, the Israelis don't speak with the Hamas leadership. They go to Hussein al-Sheikh. There's different policy bodies that were set up in Gaza after the Oslo Accords to manage the issues on the ground. The PEA, the Palestinian Energy Authority, the CMWU, the Coastal Municipal Water Utility, the Palestinian Water Company, the PWC. You have the Khamsa Khamsa crossing, which is the Palestinian guards that kind of like allow the control and flow of goods from the Erez crossing, and then Kerem Shalom, which is in southern, southeast Gaza, where all of the goods come through on the Israeli side of the border getting through. You have the different fuel transfer points, like Nachal Oz. You have the Fishing Commission, which allows the governance of the Palestinian fishing industry 6 kilometers off the coast of Gaza. Whenever Israel has a problem with any of these bodies, which are actually controlled by Hamas inside of Gaza, but controlled by the Palestinian Authority and their money aside from the Ministry of Finance in Ramallah, the Israelis don't speak to Hamas, they speak to Hussein al-Sheikh. And Hussein al-Sheikh doesn't even live in Gaza. He visits every once in a while. He's the card-carrying member of the former Fatah members of Gaza City, who, if he was to identify with them, he would probably be shot with the other 3 individuals of Fatah who were killed this morning by Hamas for killing that senior army commander in a public execution. So Sheikh will be asked to implement the agreement in Gaza. It's a no-go. If Abbas is in power, who would he rely on to implement the agreement on the Palestinian side? You have Rami Hamdallah. He's the current Palestinian prime minister. He's a political appointee. He replaced Salam Fayyad when Fayyad abruptly resigned in 2013. He has no political clout in the PA whatsoever. Yasser Abed Rabbo, a former Palestinian Minister of Finance and I think Minister of Foreign Affairs, also no political clout. Marwan Barghouti, leading the Palestinian prisoners' strike by eating Kit Kats in his toilet. If anyone saw those videos. His credibility, gone. The Kit Kat ended his political career. Or whatever it was, maybe some good hummus. On the Asla, if you guys know what that means. Nabil Sha'af, another Palestinian leader. He's somewhere in his 70s. Sayyab Arakat, the penultimate Palestinian negotiator. He knows how to negotiate so well that he's never finished a negotiation. He just keeps on going on and on and on and on. He's the Energizer Bunny of Palestinian negotiations. There's a ministry of negotiations. That's how long that we've set ourselves up, fully funded by the West to continue ad infinitum until the end of time. Hanan Ashrawi, another Palestinian authority official, no credibility in terms of the political base. She leads what's called the Third Way. It's a party of two people, herself and Salam Fayyad. And they're just looking for the third candidate to find a way between the two of them disagreeing all the time. Mohammed Dahlan, currently the former head of Fatah in Gaza, currently hanging out in some large tower in the United Arab Emirates. The Egyptian and Emiratis' favorite to take over the PA should Abbas ever go. Unfortunately, no one in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank or Ramallah likes him. So it's nice to put all your chips on him, but he really has no influence whatsoever. Another, Jibril Rajoub, the current head of the Palestinian Olympics Committee, trying to get Israel kicked out of FIFA so they can't play in any international soccer tournaments. He was just slapped with a $300 million lawsuit when he landed in New York for being behind the killing of Americans when he was head of the Palestinian security forces back in '95. Those security forces were actually trained by the CIA, by George Tenet, back in '95. He's not going anywhere. And lastly, Mohammed Shtatia, another one who's at like 82. So of all of these guys, the one that we should most focus on is Mahmoud el-Alul. Alul, appointed by the Fatah Central Committee as the first Fatah vice president, is considered popular within the party. He's a longtime leader of Fatah's armed wing before the group's leadership from Tunis moved to the West Bank in '95. He was the former Palestinian labor minister, and he was elected to the Central Committee about 8 years ago in 2009. He advocates nonviolent resistance against Israel, including boycotts and protests, but as recently as 2013, he announced that Fatah has not renounced its right to use violence. So I listed 10 senior PA officials, Fatah officials. We already went through, like I said, Marwan Isma, Isma Haniya, Khaled Mashal, Mahmoud al-Zahar, Mohammed Dif, and Yahya Sinwar. Who exactly is going to implement this protocol that Mahmoud Abbas is going to sign on? When he's having liver failure or liver cancer and kidney failure, who exactly is going to put this forward? So I want to move from that 0.0001% likelihood that they even sign something to what I think is the 99.99999% chance that the conflict will continue, as it has after every single negotiated round, where the talks take place, they break down, Abbas or whatever Palestinian figure in control says no, and then the US will have to adopt a new policy. They can continue with the status quo, trying to get confidence building measures, but I say put your foot on the throttle, gas the U.S. peacemaking industry all the way towards what I would call one of the finishing a war industry, which is how wars throughout history have ended, throughout time. Since 2,000 years ago, wars end when one side loses. They do not end just when one side wins. Once an enemy feels the bitter pill of defeat, once they go through the bitter crucible of acknowledging that they no longer have any possible way to fight, their incitement has ended, their capacity to be able to thrive under rejectionism, their ability to define their narrative as one is losing, therefore they feel like they're winning as long as they're losing, all has to end under the current Palestinian national narrative of rejectionism. Only once they accept Israel by being defeated can they build their own polity, their own economy, their own culture, their own society, not based as it currently is on rejecting Israel, but one which is based on accepting the right for Israel to exist as a Jewish state, living next door side by side with the Palestinians, and one in which they write a stern letter to the editor to the Jerusalem Post instead of strapping on a suicide belt and bombing a bus when they get upset with an Israeli action. That's what we're looking for. And now I'll tell you a little bit of how we're going to get there. How much time do we have? It's 12:48. It's supposed to end at 1 o'clock?
No.
Oh.
We have the room till at least 1:30.
1:30? When does everybody have to get going?
I'm retired.
Let's try to get the end of the talk at 1, and then we'll do questions after that. Is that fair? Okay. The Middle East Forum and its Israel Victory Project aims to steer U.S. and Israeli policy towards backing an Israeli victory over the Palestinians as a means to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. This isn't just about the Palestinians, it's also about Israel's Arab neighbors. Enough of doing the same thing that Einstein defines as insanity, the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Decades of peace processing have left matters worse off. The time has come for a new approach, one in which is a complete rethinking of the problem that draws on Israel's earlier and successful strategy of deterrence. Can anyone here tell me Israel's war-making strategy of how they win wars? They bring the fight to the enemy's territory. Israel has never fought, since 48, Israel has never fought a defensive war. Even in Yom Kippur, it only ended when the Egyptian Fourth Army was encircled by Ariel Sharon. The way in which Israel wins wars is it made its enemies lose. They gave up their will to fight. Stop pressuring Jerusalem to make painful concessions. The only thing they end up being painful for is what the Palestinians who end up dying in further armed conflict perpetuated by their leadership and Israeli civilians and soldiers between the ages of 18 and 21 and sometimes reservists who have to pay the price of failed negotiations. Instead, our recommendation is for the U.S. Congress to push and support Israel to have victory, convincing Palestinians and others that the Jewish state will endure and that dreams of its elimination will fail. That there is a price to pay for always having your narrative be one based on losing. As Daniel Pipes, the Middle East Forum president and originator of this idea, explains, Israel wins when the Jews of Hebron have no more need for security than the Arabs of Nazareth. Now, on the negative side, Washington and Jerusalem should put Palestinians on notice that no benefit will flow to them until they prove their acceptance of Israel. There's a difference between saying, like in 1988 and in 1993, yes, we accept the right for this entity, the Zionist entity, to live in the pre-67 borders. Palestinians should be on notice that no benefit will flow to them until they prove acceptance of Israel, overhauling their educational system to take out the demonization of Jews in Israel, telling them the truth about Jewish ties to Jerusalem, and accepting normal commercial, cultural, and human relations with Israelis. Until that, no diplomacy, no discussion of final status, no recognition of a state, and certainly no financial aid or weapons should go to the Palestinian Authority. On the positive side, you can't have a stick without a carrot. For anybody who... Anybody? Okay. I'll stop with that. Washington and Jerusalem should work with the Arab states that Trump approached earlier this week and others to induce the Palestinians to accept Israel's existence by demonstrating the hopelessness of their cause, focusing them on building their own society and institutions rather than destroying Israel's. So it's not as if though everything is punitive against the Palestinians. There has to be a ray of light that is existent for the Palestinians at the end of the dark tunnel of rejectionism. Now, what that exists like in specific policy measures would be as follows. First, qualified industrial zones. A segment set up under the Camp David Accords that Jimmy Carter was there when the Israelis and Egyptians were negotiating, allows for U.S. tax benefits to be given to either side, the Egyptians or the Israelis, or in this case, Palestinian business owners and Israeli business owners, to start having joint economic projects in areas currently in Area A and B controlled by the Palestinians, but I would suggest moving to Area C, that the 62% of the West Bank, where Israel still has civilian and security control. Encourage Palestinian business owners to get U.S. economic benefits through tax credits or through other reduction of tariffs by encouraging cooperation with Israeli businesses. Second, start building new Palestinian cities that will A, be good for Palestinian jobs, and B, be a place where Palestinian refugees can be absorbed from in the Palestinian polity of Area A and B, much like Bashar al-Masri, who is currently building a new Palestinian called Rawabi. The thing with, does anyone know about Rawabi? It's a 150, 200,000 resident capacity new town about 10 minutes north of Ramallah, actually designed and built by Israeli contractors with Palestinian labor, so it was good for the Israeli economy too that they were building this. And they have a big picture of Marilyn Monroe in this big amphitheater that's behind the southern point of the city. I don't know what that's, and Elvis too. And some kind of weird Palestinian obsession with 50s and 60s pop culture stars in the United States. But build more Rawabis. Get the Palestinians to take control of the refugee camps, which are currently under the aegis of UNRWA. Put Palestinian municipal controls and borders in those areas. Move them out of the tents. They're actually not tents. They're big concrete structures where they pretty bad beds right now. It's not that comfortable to live there. And start building new Palestinian cities in the areas which will eventually become part of a Palestinian state, if that's ever even something that can happen decades from now. Thirdly, end the ability for the international community to continue defining Palestinian refugees as something that's multi-generational, regardless of their residency, and also regardless of the citizenship and nationality in which they possess. I'd like to thank Representative Kay Granger, Representative Hal Rogers, and Representative Chris Stewart for putting a amendment, or not an amendment, language in the fiscal year 2018 appropriations for foreign operations and state and foreign operations appropriations bill that essentially ends U.S. support for this Palestinian refugee status. The State Department has been put on notice with the passing of the past appropriations bill for FY 2017, which says to them that they now have, the State Department has to define why the current UN RWA status of a Palestinian refugee is good for U.S. national security interests. The second step is what Granger, Rogers, and Stewart have put place in correcting that 70-year-old problem of perpetuating a Palestinian refugee narrative. You're going to go from 6 million people who are getting US dollars to support their idea of being a refugee, and it'll go down to about 30,000, those who might actually still be refugees, from 47 to 48. And the fourth policy concept, which I think is important, is to reward those Palestinians that accept Israel and punish those who reject it. So there are special visas which are given to Palestinian peacemakers, like the CEO of the Israeli-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce, certain Palestinian ministers who reject the Palestinian national boycott movement against Israel, those who aren't tied to violence. Start giving them more benefits so you build up a pro-peace, a real pro-peace camp, anti-rejectionist, pro-acceptance of Israel camp within the Palestinian polity, rather than just saying no, 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 no to all the Palestinians. We're starting at 20% of the Palestinian people who accept the idea of there being a Jewish state living next to Israel. If you look at Daniel Polisar's argument that he put forward in an article about 6 months ago on surveying which Palestinians actually want peace, we're not starting from zero. We have to get the Palestinian public up to 50% plus one. I'd like it at 60 or 70%, which I think will take 15 to 20 years, an entire educational cycle once they start reforming their institutions to get to that point. But you can't always say no. We can't have a Israeli or a U.S. position which rejects the idea of Palestinians having a future in that area. Martin Sherman, a columnist for the Israeli Strategic Studies Institute, got into a really long debate for the last 4 weeks, column after column, giving kudos and caveats, of what he called, to the Israel Victory proposition, where he said that a Palestinian state negates the idea of Israel ever winning. But our argument is that eventually 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if the Palestinian culture has changed, if their political system has changed, if they've ended rejectionism, I don't even know if that's going to happen. But should that happen, the Palestinians should be given the opportunity to prove themselves, rather than to initially eliminate the idea and have sipuach, annexation, or a 8-state Emirati-like solution. You know, a 2-state solution should be one of the options considered on the table, along with all the other ways in which to finish the conflict. But we tend to spend our time speaking about peace solutions without ever confronting the way in which we get there. The way that the Knesset Israel Victory Caucus, the sister caucus of the Congressional Israel Victory Caucus, calls it is bli nitzachon ein pitaron. Without victory, there is no solution. So we propose Israel's winning against the Palestinians is the way to actually start talking about final status issues. Bli nitzachon, without victory, ein pitaron. There's no solution. Sounds good in Hebrew. And now I'd like to draw a little bit of a parallel to kind of finish the end of this talk. Almost exactly 14 years ago, a little bit now, 3 weeks later, on May 1st, 2003, President George W. Bush gave a speech aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. The speech wasn't that notable in terms of what he actually said, but it became an instant sensation because the president's head, hung above the president's head was a banner that read, "Mission Accomplished." The speech was about the war in Iraq, so clearly the mission was not accomplished. The war was just getting started, and the conflict continues to this day. But the scene raises an instructive point. I'll repeat what I said earlier. Wars don't end because the victor makes a proclamation. They don't end because of decisive battles or political restraint. Wars only end when one side, the losing side, accepts that it has been defeated and stops fighting. Now, the allegory that we make is that we want the Palestinians to feel like the American people felt watching their television screens on May 1st, 1975, when the last U.S. helicopter left the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces were rolling in to complete their takeover of South Vietnam. And America didn't lose its ability to fight. It still had nuclear forces. It still had a nuclear deterrent. It didn't have a reduction in manpower that was significantly harming U.S. national security interests, even though 60,000 American troops were killed during that conflict from 61 to 73. But the American people said, we no longer support this war anymore. We have lost the will to fight to continue supporting a conflict in Vietnam. That's how we want the Palestinians to feel. In 1948, Israel declared its independence. Immediately, the nascent state found itself in a war against 5 of its neighbors. And its strategy was one of deterrence. Every time an attack happened against Israel, or there was a provocation in the international community, Israel struck back. Or it struck first, like we saw at the raid into Jordan after PLO Fedayeen forces were attacking Israel in 1964. Again in 1967 and 1973, Israel faced existential conflicts in one. But then it got lazy, and it adopted an early form of Stockholm Syndrome, being beholden by peace negotiations rather than the will to exist as a state independent of any future conflict. After several defeats, the Egyptians and eventually the Jordanians accepted the fact that they had lost, and they failed to defeat Israel and reach peace accords that have held for decades. The Palestinians, however, never accepted the plain and simple fact that they lost the kinetic war in 1948, and their patrons lost all subsequent wars. In 2012, the rest of the Arab nations accepted this. When the Arab Spring ended the ability for Arab nations and Arab rulers to use the Palestinians as the proverbial lever of Arab discontent on the street, and it started turning towards Arabs self-immolating themselves in the streets of Tunisia and other cities, the ability for Israel to then get closer to the Arab states was presented. And I think that's what's happened over the last 5 years. In short, the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians continues because the Palestinians have refused to allow themselves to move forward. They're stuck in 1947, and their entire national identity and self-identity is perpetuated by that myth that by losing they still have to win, which they're not going to. Among the Israeli political class, nearly everyone agrees that Palestinian recognition and acceptance is critical. A two-state solution, long the stated goal of peace talks, cannot function without mutual recognition and respect. But there's a serious disagreement within Israel itself about how to get there. Like I said, there's no a path towards a solution. Every Israeli has his own peace process solution, but no one can actually tell you how to be able to do it. From the prime minister to the guy running the Basta in Ben Yehuda Street in Tel Aviv. The approach over much of the last 2 decades has been to use carrots rather than sticks. Show the Palestinians how much they have to gain, the argument goes, and they'll come to accept Zionism out of some level of self-interest. This aspirational approach culminated in the Oslo Accords. The Palestinians agreed to a normal recognition of Israel not as a Jewish state, but just as a state, and to lay down their arms. But in actuality, all this did was switch tactics, moving away from outright warfare, besides the 2 intifadas and the 3 operations in Gaza, and towards delegitimization. Today, the Palestinians are no closer to accepting Israel than they were 70 years ago. Many in Israel know what they must do to make progress towards ending this conflict. Israel must deal with the Palestinians the way it dealt with its other adversaries, through deterrence. It's the only option. And not just passive deterrence. I'm talking about what's called tailored and active deterrence. Finding the enablers of rejectionism and making them pay a price, whether it be institutions, whether it be individuals, or whether it be other international bodies that the U.S. in its role as Israel's greatest ally can punish by awarding Palestinians for continuing their rejectionism. Deterrence doesn't mean just talking tough, and doesn't just mean responding to terrorism. What it means is that Israel must build large-scale policies that encourage Palestinians to abandon their rejection of the Jewish state. The Palestinians must recognize that continuing the conflict makes them worse off, not better. Going back to what I was saying beforehand, the ad hoc liaison committee should end. Peace conferences, which rely on Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories, the military government in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, should no longer have cooperation of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. The Palestinians don't need to love Israel, but they need to abandon terrorism and violence. And also, their non-violent means of rejecting Israel, like incitement, at all levels. They need to recognize Jewish ties to Jerusalem and normalize relations with Israel and its citizens. In short, they need to accept that the war is over and Israel won. Once they've accepted defeat, and there always has to be a positive side to this, the Palestinians can begin building a real society. They can focus on building culture and increasing economic opportunity. Without the revolutionary obsession that prevents them from truly moving forward, the Palestinian people can hold their leaders accountable for improving their lives. But they'll never get there if their young people continue to fight a war that their great-grandparents lost. With this as a backdrop, Trump's visit to Abbas on Wednesday proved highly instructive for what I think is the camp that says that negotiations isn't the way to get forward to peace. And the question has been presented to the Trump administration and also to the US Congress and the policymakers, whether it be in this room, watching on Facebook, or on this video at a later time. Will the Trump administration abandon the politics of perpetual conflict embraced by its predecessors? Or will the president insist that the United States supports Israel in its efforts to forge a lasting peace? If the answer is the latter and our goal is peace, we must get serious about breaking the Palestinian will to continue fighting this war. We must make it clear that Israel won and the Palestinians lost. Thank you.